Fragen. Ja, wir haben jetzt von Hanf gesprochen und ich muss dazu erzählen, dass, ich zitiere es jetzt, ja, Hanf ist die weltweit am meisten missverstandene Pflanze. Ein weiteres Zitat, es kann nicht oft genug betont werden, der Hanf gehört zu den wichtigsten Heilpflanzen der Medizin. Ich habe beide Zitate aus einem wirklich lesenswerten Buch entnommen. Das Buch heißt Hanfmedizin, wie Hanf bei Schmerzen, Rheuma, Krebs und Stress hilft. Geschrieben hat dieses Buch nicht weniger als die Präsidentin des Internationalen Instituts für Cannabinoide ICANNA, Dr. Tanja Bagar aus Ljubljana. Und wir sind sehr, sehr stolz, dass sie heute da ist. Einen großen Applaus, bitte. Die Frau Bagar, die Tanja, die Frau Bagar versteht sehr gut Deutsch, bevorzugt es, diesen Vortrag auf Englisch zu halten. Ich hoffe, das ist für Sie alle okay. Und der Vortrag heißt dann, dass wir uns ein bisschen eingerufen auf Englisch, The Effect of Cannabinoids on the Human Body and its Reward System. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to Tanja Bagar.
Hi. Yes, I'm very happy and I was very honored to be invited here. I do speak German and I do understand German, but following native German speakers is always terribly embarrassing, so if I can, I stick to my English. But I can answer questions in German later, so we can do like a mix and match and try to take it from here. Okay, so the topic of my talk today is to try to understand what the fuss is about with these cannabinoids. So what do they do? Where do they come from? What happens when we consume them? Why is this plant and these molecules are one of the 4 plant species that have fascinated our humankind more than anything else? What do they do? And this is why we will be talking about these biological effects of cannabinoids, and even we will touch a little bit about what they do with our reward system, because we know we all like to be rewarded. Okay. Yeah. So cannabis. This is the plant that from one side it's kind of called, it was during prohibition, which I'm hoping will in practice and officially end very soon. In Slovenia we're not seeing this, we're still I'm trying to look for a nice word that doesn't include cursing. Yeah, in Slovenia, we're not seeing a lot of this, especially in patients. We're just now having quite a few patients arrested for possessing cannabis or cannabis resin, chronic patients that have exhausted medical treatment, still being arrested, still being taken to jail. So we're seeing very little of prohibition and still a lot of consequences from this, where cannabis was called the devil's plant that leads into the world of crime and other drugs, and eventually you die. This is how the prohibition was started, and the truth, there is very little science behind prohibition. But on the other hand, we at the Institute ICANNA, we work a lot with patients, and we see this in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, that there is this idea, especially among chronic patients, that cannabis is like a panacea. It just heals everything. It doesn't matter if you're bald or have an ingrown toenail or impotent or cancer patient or multiple sclerosis. It doesn't matter. You just take a few droplets of the cannabis oil and it will all be fine. And this is another huge misconception. I will try to explain in my talk today that cannabinoids hold a tremendous potential in medicine, but this potential is not limitless. So we know very well from science what cannabinoids can do, which cannabinoids can do what, if and how they should be combined with conventional therapy, but they are not the magical stick that heals everything. So this is another misconception. And both of these, I usually say that the truth is somewhere in between. So neither is it a devil's drug, neither is it a panacea that heals everything. But luckily, we have a lot of data. So this cannabinoids and this plant is one of the best studied plants that we have. If you go to PubMed or other scientific databases and Google cannabinoids or search for endocannabinoid system, phytocannabinoids, you get hundreds, thousands of scientific studies, literature reviews, research papers. So I think it's about time we start talking about scientific facts and not about these myths that we're still carrying from previous years. Since the topic of my today talk is also touching about the reward system, it's good to kind of see that the debate a lot of time goes with cannabis. Is it a drug? Does it have an addictive potential? Is it a medicine? Does it support health? Or as a potentially addictive substance, can it even decrease your health? And today I will try to explain where about do we lie with this. So to understand what cannabinoids do, we have to dive not into chemistry, but a little bit into our cellular biology and to understand what our body is made of at the cellular level. So we all know that our bodies are made of, okay, heels are very difficult after 2 years of no live talks. So we know that we have these typical anatomical systems, so the muscular system, cardiovascular, and so forth. But there's one system that in medical school still today, at least in Slovenia, are not taught. And this is the system that we will now be talking about, this grand endocannabinoid system that is in my perception, the missing link to understand a lot of chronic diseases and to really understand the potential that cannabinoids hold in medicine and as well in, not only in medicine, but just also to maintain a well-being. So, okay, so our human body from a biochemical perspective is fairly complex. We have a lot of different organs and tissues. We have a lot of different cells that if we look at them, we look at these cells under a microscope, they look very differently. For example, a kidney cell is very different than a muscle cell. And this is because they're performing very specific functions in our body, and this is why they kind of have these very diverse morphologies. For example, immune cells look very different than muscle cells. But at the basic, every cell in our body has a pretty uniform way of functioning. And this is a typical human cell, and our body is made of, this is not that it was ever counted, just a combination of biologists and mathematicians calculated that our body is made of about 35 trillion different cells. And if we have a look at how this would look, so this would be if we would look into our body with a really excellent microscope, and this one spheric thing would be one cell, and we would go into it, we would see that this blue thing is the nucleus. This is where all the genes are stored, and then there are different organelles that serve very specific functions, but you will see this yellow thing around is the membrane. This is what on one side divides each cell from its neighbors, but as we will see, this is also where a lot of the communication between cells and its environment happens. And because we're made out of so many different cells, one of the most important things for a human body, and not only human, all vertebrate animals, is that, these cells, so many of them, are able to communicate with each other. So if I want to stand here, make hopefully some sense, and coordinate my movements, all of my cells, all of my muscles, neurons, brains, everything has to communicate with each other. And luckily, our cells are much better at this than humans. If we would compare to, I don't know, even a household, let alone us as a human species, our cells are luckily much better at talking and even much, much better at listening than humans. And this cellular communication, so this what happens between cells, this information that passes from one cell to another so that our body can function as a one whole unit, is functioning fairly well. So our cells are highly communicative. So they love to talk. They tell a lot of vital information. They tell a lot of jokes. They communicate very effectively. But not only do they kind of send out a lot of information, they're also very well equipped and very good at listening. And this is basically what enables these multicellular organisms, which we are as well, to communicate. And these cells, our cells don't have WhatsApps and messengers and etc., but they produce signaling molecules. And we all know about hormones. So hormones are typical signaling molecules that, for example, I don't know, our pancreas sends out a message that there's too much sugar in our blood, sends out insulin, or sometimes at other times glucagon, and this kind of sends the other cells a message that they take up too much sugar from the blood. And similarly, you know, we have a lot of hormones. There is a lot of talk about hormones. There's also neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin. These are all signaling molecules. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is because cannabinoids, at their basic function, are signaling molecules. This is what, when they come into our bodies, and as we will later also see, when our body makes them itself, this is basically at the basis what they do. They enable our cells to communicate with each other. So there's always, in any signaling event, so whenever cells are trying to have a chit-chat, one of the cells has to send a message, meaning produce a neurotransmitter, a cannabinoid, a hormone, and another cell has to listen to it, has to be able to receive this message and do something with it. And interestingly enough, when we narrow down to cannabinoids, basically all cellular types in our body that have been so far studied are capable of producing cannabinoids, which is very different from hormones. So we know for hormones you have to have a specific tissue, but cannabinoids, mostly every cell type that we know is capable of producing cannabinoids, so capable of sending this message. And also, vast majority of our tissues and organs are capable of receiving this message. The only part of the brain that is the only part of the body that is fairly not able to hear, but hears fairly poorly, is the brainstem, where the centers that regulate breathing and heartbeat. And this is good and bad. So this is one of the reasons why there has never in history of humankind been proven death due to overdose of cannabis, because there's very little receptors for cannabis, for THC, in this region of the brain where we have regulation of breathing and heartbeat. I know in Slovenia there have been quite a number of attempts to prove that certain death cases were due to overdose with cannabis, but then when you look at the autopsy reports, you go like, God damn. Just to highlight, this was our institute, because our report in Slovenia for drug abuse stated two deaths due to, among other drugs, blah, blah, blah. And then comes cannabis, 2 death cases of fairly young people. And then the other cannabis, this was in 2016, the other experts of the cannabis world call and say, never in history of humankind has there been a death due to overdose, and now in 1 year in Slovenia there has been 2. What are you doing? And we go like, okay, we'll look at the reports, and we see a young woman, she went to a party, she had alcohol, she had cannabis, she fell, hit her head, had a massive hemorrhage in the brain, went to the hospital, got a secondary pneumonia in the hospital, and eventually 10 days later died of complications in her respiratory system and brain bleeding. Obviously she was THC positive, and death due to cannabis overdose. You go like, what? Okay, Okay, we were at the cell signaling. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that all of our body is capable of producing and sending this cannabinoid message, and all of our body is capable. There's not a single tissue, organ, a cell in our body that doesn't respond to cannabinoids. There is, for a while, there was this, how should we call it, this term in medicine that said that in medicine we have responders and non-responders. So if all of your body is equipped with receptors that do only this, sense for cannabinoids, how can you be a non-responder? How? Maybe you didn't get the dose right. Maybe you didn't get the cannabis ratios right. But you can, if you're alive, you cannot be a non-responder. So, and since these are signaling molecules, how do they differ from other signaling molecules? So what's the difference between them and, for example, hormones? The main difference is that so these molecules usually neurotransmitters and hormones, they send a message. So if always in our nervous system, the message goes from this blue one to the bottom one, cannabinoids are fairly different because they're one of the rare ones that send the message in the upper direction. This is why we call them retrograde signaling messengers. And this makes their biological effects fairly unique because so when this lower cell in our nervous system realizes that there's too much going on, that there's way too much signals happening, that there's way too much neurotransmitters being produced, then this lower one produces cannabinoids. They travel up, bind to this receptor CB1R, and then this binding causes this upper cell to go, I call it like, when you're driving the car and you go from the 5th gear to the 3rd or 2nd gear. So all of the nervous system just kind of slows down the activity. And this is what we see in studies all the time. So if you add CBD to neurons that are kind of normally excited, meaning us at a fairly good, not stressed day, then cannabinoids don't do much. So this retrograde signaling doesn't change much. But if we add CBD to cells that are hyper-excited, which would be me now, or on a really big day or stressful day, then there's a significant reduction in the neuronal activity. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of people seek out or look for cannabinoids for these states, for reducing anxiety, which is also too many neurotransmitters, for reducing stress, for being able to kind of shut down the nervous system before we go to sleep so that our brains don't constantly go, like, at least mine does. So this is the reason, because these signaling molecules travel upwards and tell the blue cell to slow down. So today we talked a lot about phytocannabinoids, their analytics, which ones should be in the plants and products and so forth, and which ones not. Maybe here I would just like to, I've had quite a number of lectures concerning the evolution of the endocannabinoid system and the evolution of the cannabis plant itself on this planet. And I know that the legislation is trying to do right and all of this novel food, but this cannabis plant has been on our planet way before humans ever appeared on this planet. About 30 million years before humans appeared on the planet, other plants and cannabis as well has been on this planet. So who's the novel one? I mean, a broader picture. I know legislation is doing its best, but just as human beings, the perception of what's novel is, yeah, okay, never mind. Okay, so the phytocannabinoids, we've seen these chemical structures, but as I mentioned, our body is very well equipped with receptors to bind these phytocannabinoids. I'm sure most of you here have heard about Dr. Meshulam. He's like the Mick Jagger of the cannabis world. Wherever he goes, flocks of people follow. He's the researcher that's now 80-something years old who has discovered the structure of THC, who has been in the group that discovered how THC works, finding the receptors that it binds to, finding our own endocannabinoids. So when the scientists figured out that we have specialized receptors in our body to bind THC, this was a huge discovery. And then it became very interesting to search where in our bodies do we have them. And then scientists searched, and as I mentioned, found practically that there's not a tissue, organ in our body that doesn't have cannabinoid receptors. And so, because our bodies are fairly good in being economic and our cells don't do things that are not vital for their survival. And for us to for our cells to produce these cannabinoid receptors, just in case one of these days we feel like, I don't know, having a joint or a cookie, it doesn't make any sense because most people don't do that, at least statistically. But it didn't make biological sense. So the hypothesis came that highly likely these receptors in our body serve something else, and these plant cannabinoids just fit into the same receptor. And a lot of research was going on, and about 15 years later, this hypothesis was actually proven. So our body makes our own THC if it's really healthy, and it makes our own molecule that resembles in biological function to CBD. So our own THC is called anandamide. People who are maybe a little bit spiritually open will find resonance with this word. This word comes from Sanskrit word and means bliss. So like really deep inner sense of joy and peace. And this is, the name came because when in the lab it was discovered and synthesized and given to lab animals, they exhibited deep bliss. This is why it's called anandamide. And actually, our own molecules, when our bodies produce anandamide, it does a similar effect. It lowers stress levels. It's very pain. It relieves pain. It relaxes. It brings the nervous system to a really deep calm. This is not only in mice and rats, also in humans. And if we look at anandamide and THC and 2-AG and CBD, they don't look chemically much alike. But as everything in nature, all molecules form a three-dimensional structure, and this is a structure of THC, and this bigger part, is the part where these molecules bind to the cannabinoid receptor. This is like a key lock and a key. It just has to three-dimensionally fit well together. And this part is very much alike for THC and anandamide. And this is the reason they can have very similar biological effects, although they're chemically fairly different. So once cannabinoids, in best case scenario, of course, our endocannabinoid system is so extremely well-functioning and so fine-tuned, we produce all cannabinoids that we need for being healthy. Or in other cases, we take some cannabinoids in, they bind to receptors. So this is supposed to be a cell, and all of these things sticking out are supposed to be receptors that then take different messages. They bind serotonin, they bind cannabinoids, they transport natrium and kalium and so forth. And cannabinoids, when they enter into our bodies, this is how they function. They find cells and receptors and dock onto these receptors. And once they dock, there's always a part of the receptor on the outside of the cell, and the whole point is that it's trying to tell the cell what's happening on the outside so the cell can respond. So in case of pancreas, it was too much sugar, glucose binds to these receptors, causes the cells to start to produce insulin. And very similarly, it happens for a vast majority of these signaling molecules, and of course also for cannabinoids. And we have two very well-researched cannabinoid receptors. This is the CB1, that was obviously the number because it was first discovered, and is the one that binds THC. And then there is a CB2 receptor that has also been now quite extensively studied. And then GPR 55 is now called cannabinoid receptor type 3. And as the research continues, we see that there's many more receptors that these cannabinoids can bind to. They're not only limited to these to these two specific cannabinoid receptors. And now if we have a look, so this CB1 receptor, the one that THC and anandamide bind to, is mostly found in the central nervous system, so in our brain and in our spine. And the CB2 receptor is more universally distributed throughout our body. But if we would look for the highest concentration, where do we find it? It is on our immune cell. This is one of the reasons why cannabinoids are so well studied as immunomodulators, why they're so excellent in being anti-inflammatory, because there's a lot of receptors on these immune cells. So cannabinoids, as we know, are fat soluble. This is why most of the products are some kind of oils, because CBD, THC, they're all fat soluble. And if you remember at the beginning, I showed this image of a cell having this round, yellow line around itself. So this membrane is also made of fat. And so fat likes fat. And if we imagine that this would be like a membrane around and this tiny thing that just flew through are cannabinoids. Anything that is fat soluble can pass through the membrane without necessarily binding to cannabinoid receptors. And we know that a portion of these biological effects that are well proven for cannabinoids are completely receptor independent. So as the researchers usually do, they produced in a lab mice that had no CB1 or CB2 receptors and gave them cannabinoids and had a look if there's anything happening. And they figured out, for example, that the neuroprotective and antioxidant effects of cannabinoids are completely receptor independent. So I'm just trying to point that they have several mechanisms of what they can do in our bodies and several ways how they can achieve their effects. And now coming to the point, so what do they do? So we have this endocannabinoid system made of these receptors. Our own body produces endocannabinoids. What do they do? What does this system do in our body? So one would have figured that since this is still not taught, for example, in medical schools, that this is a fairly new discovery. But no, the discovery of the endocannabinoid system goes back to the 1980s. So this is now known for 40 years. So a lot of time has been devoted to studying this. So what does this endocannabinoids do? What is this message that the cannabinoids send? Basically, we now know that the basic function of this endocannabinoid system is to keep or return our body into balance. So we can imagine every cell is fairly dynamic. In every cell, in every moment, there's about 12 to 15,000 biochemical reactions happening, but everything has to stay within very strict limits. Our temperature, our pH value, if you've seen your blood results, there's always limits for natrium, kalium, So strict limits for when our body is healthy and in balance. And it turns out that this is exactly what this endocannabinoid system does. So it's like a checking point. So whenever there is something in our body that pops out of this balance, we produce cannabinoids, and they activate whatever is necessary in our body to return our cells, our organs, our body back to balance. And we know, for example, if our temperature jumps, one of the first things that is produced is anandamide that binds the hypothalamus where we regulate our body temperature. For example, now I'm a microbiologist by basic profession. Viruses were very popular. So if we breathe in viruses, the first thing that happens is that we produce endocannabinoids, and they attract, as signaling molecules, they bring immune cells into our lungs to clear them out. So whatever threatens to kind of jeopardize our basic biochemical balance, we produce cannabinoids, and they are trying very hard to keep us in balance. It means from every cell to tissues to organ. This is the next slide. Meanings from every aspect of our functioning. And it starts at every cell, because every cell in our body is sensitive to these molecules. And as I said, in ideal case scenario, we produce all these cannabinoids that we need to keep us in check, to keep our biochemistry, to keep our balance. But living the way we live, I think only the monks in Himalaya still have an intact endocannabinoid system. Most of us living in environments where we breathe in toxins, drink toxins, eat food that's sometimes has more pesticides than nutrients, being stressed out, not sleeping. This is all challenges. There was a calculation by these evolutionary biologists that today, in a typical modern society, our endocannabinoid system has to jump and correct something in one day the same amount of time as 100 years ago it would do in a month. So now it's constantly, every time you get upset in traffic, every time you get a fight with your boss, every time there's something that you either feel or breathe in or eat that gets you out of balance, your body has to correct it. And it does that via cannabinoids. And now we already know that because our endocannabinoid system has a lot of work to do, it can happen that it can't do this work efficiently anymore. And this is what we call now endocannabinoid deficiency. Like with every system in our body, you push it, eventually, I can't say it dries out, but it cannot hold up to all the challenges. And there's been a number of publications on this topic that a lot of the chronic illnesses can be led back to endocannabinoid deficiency. And we now speculate that this dysregulation in the endocannabinoid system, that our endocannabinoid system cannot do this protective function anymore, is the first domino dice to fall that then eventually leads to diverse array of chronic diseases. This is also the reason why we feel that many fields in medicine that deal with chronic diseases, is it autoimmune, inflammatory diseases, oncological diseases, all of these chronic conditions, you cannot develop cancer if you have a perfectly functioning endocannabinoid system. You cannot have a chronic bowel inflammation and develop Crohn's disease if you have a functioning endocannabinoid system. So there has to be a fundamental dysfunction in this protective mechanism to allow the body to derange in certain chronic conditions. And this is one of the reasons we see that cannabinoids, in Europe we have quite a few challenges to overcome in using cannabinoids in medicine. But if we look at Israel, that they have 45 years of experience treating patients with cannabinoids, they have seen extraordinary results in cancer patients, in autism, in epilepsy we have in Europe as well, very good studies. For example, in dementia, huge array of medical conditions can be improved if we start correcting the endocannabinoid system. And in our bodies, a lot of things function in hierarchical order. So we know that, for example, certain glands in our body have bosses somewhere else. Hypothalamus, hypophysis, how's this called? So it's always in a certain hierarchical order. Who's the boss? And from what we know now, this endocannabinoid system is like the top Oberchef, like the top chef of our biochemistry. So a lot of this dysregulation, for example, in serotonin, which is linked to depression or anxiety, it can be seen as a consequence of not having a properly functioning endocannabinoid system. And this is why we see that cannabinoids can fix a lot. So for example, you take 10 patients, you give them the same dose of CBD, or preferably also other cannabinoids, and you can see that they respond very differently because their biochemistry, their endocannabinoid system is in a different state, and they will start fixing. This balance will start showing up for someone, they will start sleeping better. For someone, they will have a lot better muscle powers. This is, for example, very evident in professional sports. Some people that have, I don't know, inflammation in the gut, this is where the effects will be seen. Because the basic thing that these molecules do, either our own or from the plant world, they fix this balance. You know, they try to bring us as close to biochemical balance as possible. And now this biochemistry is sometimes hard to imagine what it means for our life. Now this, I mentioned Dr. Meshulam already, and Di Marzo is an Italian researcher, also he's done some fundamental work in cannabinoid research. They've kind of postulated that we can best imagine what this endocannabinoid system does if we look at our appetite, our sleep patterns, our muscle strength and relaxation of our muscles, our memories, and a special, like a general protective function that we usually imagine as immune system. And now if we look, these are the questions, for example, we always ask patients, how is your appetite, how is your sleep? Do you have enough muscle power to get you through your daily activities and everything you want to do? And how good do your muscles become loose and relax when it's time to sleep? How good do you remember things that are vital and forget things that are not vital? This forgetting part has been very fascinating because we know cannabinoids, they induce forgetting. So, you know, I don't know if anyone has been high here ever, you know that you have gaps in your memory when you're high. So cannabinoids are known, even anandamide, it causes forgetting. And it was very interesting for researchers, so why is it vital? Okay, it's obvious that it's vital for us to remember where we live, who our relatives are, if they're nice, and so forth. But why is it vital for our survival to be able to forget? And of course, as researchers always do, they made mice that were not able to forget. And guess what happened? All the mice died very fast. They became highly anxious, depressed, and died within a few weeks because the amount of, and this was in a lab, in a controlled environment, the amount of information we are exposed to, just imagine that you would remember every name, every face, every chair, every color that you see today. It makes you go crazy. So it's extremely, extremely vital for us as humans to be able to forget. And this forgetting, this function in forgetting is very evident in patients with post-traumatic syndrome. This is where things you wish you would have forgotten keep coming back. And in America, there's excellent studies and a few very excellent doctors working with patients with PTSD. There were also a lot of videos and documentaries all over the internet showing patients that maybe after 20, 30 years of not being able to cope with PTSD, losing families, jobs, homes, so forth, try cannabinoids and so you don't forget, it's not like, okay, now it never happened, but you get a dissociation from the memory. You don't get emotionally fallen into the memory. And this is what balance is. Balance is not just being oblivious to the world. Balance is knowing, but having a healthy distance to it. And this is why this forgetting part is very important. Okay, how much time do I have? I've already over.
Okay. You can have some minutes more, of course.
Okay, then maybe I can have a few words on the reward system. Huh? Okay.
We're all fascinated.
Okay, so if you will.
It's up to me.
Okay, if you let me talk. But if you will let me talk, then we will be here for a very long time. Yeah, 5 minutes. Okay, so one of the topics of this talk was also the reward system. And in the reward system, this reward system is a very specialized region in our brain that lights up or is activated when we engage in a behavior, substance, anything that gives us a feeling that we want to do this again. And this is strongly linked to our emotional well-being. So we, as human beings, have biologically wired need to look for happiness. This pursuit of happiness is basically kind of ingrained into us as a human species. And it's interesting that we have brain regions that light up when we experience very positive emotional stimuli. And it's a very interesting story how researchers found these brain regions. So they took 20 young male adults. They asked each one what's their favorite actor, female actor, and they assembled 2-minute-long videos of the most emotional scenes from all of their movies combined. So it was emotion pure for 2 minutes. And they hooked them up to brain imaging, and they looked at what's happening in their brain. So all of these images and fragments from the movies were non-sexual, just very emotionally intense and very positively emotionally intense. And they mapped these brain regions that are now called very beautifully hedonic brain hotspots, because these specific brain regions light up intensely when we encounter an emotional positive stimulation. And when they looked at what neurons are in these brain regions, guess what they found? That these brain regions have an extremely high density of cannabinoid receptors. So what basically happens when we have some very intense emotional thing happening, we produce a lot of THC, our own anandamide, and it binds to these cannabinoid receptors and makes this hedonic brain hotspots light up. And this is how we are wired to want to seek out hedonic behavior, because we want to have this rush of anandamide again. We want these hedonic brain hotspots to light up. But it's not only about hedonia. So if we, when researchers evaluate these states of emotional well-being, there are two axes that they look at. So one of them is this hedonia. So when these hedonic brain hotspots light up, hedonic behavior is just this has kind of a bad reputation, but hedonic just means that you intentionally seek out behavior that gives you pleasure. So it means that you go to the movies rather than sit alone in the couch and soak because someone doesn't like you or someone didn't do what you want them to do. This is, intentionally seeking out events, things, people that give you a positive feeling. And then the other one is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is when we look at the life we already lived, if we feel that we've lived a good life or not. It doesn't mean that you like everything that happened, just that you have a good general feeling about the life you've already lived. And flourishing and full of life, having a balanced biochemistry, is somewhere where both of these two meet, so that we kind of find peace with what already has happened and we cannot change, and that we intentionally seek out people, events like this that lights up our hedonic brain hotspots. And this all comes down to cannabinoids, because in situations like this, we produce our own endocannabinoids. And there are certain parts of the brain, not only these hedonic brain hotspots, but also all of these that are red and orange and yellow. These are brain regions that have a particularly high density of cannabinoid receptors. And if we take if we would take one nerve cell from this nerve cell would have more cannabinoid receptors than all of the other receptors combined. So this would basically mean that the function of these brain regions is mostly regulated by how much cannabinoids there is in our body. And these regions are the ones that are also responsible for these typical psychoactive effects of THC. So what are they? I don't have to explain, right? So this is the regions that, for example, coordinate memory, physical coordination, that regulate pain, emotional processing, and so forth. And this is because there's so many CB1 receptors here, they bind to these regions and change the activity there. And this is why we feel a little bit different when we consume the THC. THC is one of two psychoactive cannabinoids from a plant that produces over 200 cannabinoids, and in total has 1,064 bioactive molecules. And then they focus only on THC and say this is a bad plant. I think that's very unfair. Okay, so when it comes to happiness, usually let's say the biochemistry of happiness was defined like this. So you need oxytocin, serotonin, all of these neurotransmitters and hormones that give you a good emotional state. But as I mentioned, now we know that this endocannabinoid system is actually the boss of all of our neurotransmitters and all of our hormones. We now know that cannabinoids affect how much hormones we produce in our glands. It changes how much neurotransmitters our neurons produce and everything. So actually, endocannabinoid system is the one that we want to talk to if we want long-term health. There is no such thing as long-term health without having a properly functioning endocannabinoid system. And this is why cannabinoids can do so much, because they help us navigate life and all of the nonsense that are many times around us. But they just, at the basic cellular level, they keep our shit together. You know, they help us maintain balance regardless of what's happening around us, regardless of what's happening in our bodies, in the world, and so forth. And this is because they regulate practically every single process in our body. And of course, the reward circuitry as well. Reward is a little bit linked to our stress axis. So stress is also one of these things that can cause great dysregulation, not only all these environmental stimuli, but the stress we perceive. And there's been great research done on how endocannabinoid system affects how we perceive stress. Not only, so if something happens stressfully that's stressful for everybody, like a car crash, we all produce adrenaline and so forth, but it actually changed the perception of what is threatful for us and what not. And if they took a group of people that have a well-functioning endocannabinoid system and a group that was known to have a dysfunction in the endocannabinoid system, and they put them in the same stressful environment, the ones that had a dysregulation, they produced 3 times as much adrenaline and all of the other stress hormones as the group that had a properly functioning endocannabinoid system. So we can look at this endocannabinoid system like an interface between us, our biochemistry, and the surroundings. So how do we respond to the stimulation around us to what extent does our biochemistry need to react to what everything is happening around us. So this is also, yeah, I'm wrapping up. So this can mean the difference between this and this. And this reward system is a very intricate part of our brain that also has a lot of cannabinoid receptors. And this reward circuitry is also overlaps very well with where we have the highest density of cannabinoid receptors. And this is also one of the reasons why people, I have never had this in my life, a runner's high, and I have run quite a few marathons, ever, never, ever. But some people apparently do have this surge of rewarding and positive, and I want to do this marathon again kind of a feeling after this. They for a long time it was thought that this is endorphins. Now it was proven beyond doubt that this is anandamide doing this work. And this is again goes back to the reward system, because nature, our reward system is activated when we have food, when we have sex, and when we do aerobic exercise, because these were vital in evolution for our survival. And nature found a way to reward us for seeking out food, for reproducing, and for being able to be physically active over longer periods of time. And this is where, because it activates this reward system, it was speculated that, of course, and the prohibition, that cannabis is highly addictive. Now, I will just say this statistic that between 9 and 13% of chronic cannabis users, chronic means 2 to 5 times a week, become over several decades, this is chronic use, become addicted, physically addicted to cannabis. So if you look at what tobacco does or alcohol, I'm not saying that it's not, that it doesn't hold any potential, but even this addiction always holds a background in the substrate that came. Usually people seek out cannabis as a means of coping with their life and find it helpful and then stick to it, which is very different than coping mechanism of running away from your problems and running away, hiding into something that you don't have to deal with your life and stuff. I won't go into this. It was prohibition also always stated that cannabis is like the gateway drug to other drugs and a life of crime and everything bad that the world needs. Now we actually know that science is showing that cannabinoids are many times used to treat other addictive behaviors. For example, CBD has been used in several studies to deal with the addiction to opioids. Rimonabant is a synthetic cannabinoid that is extensively studied and shows great potential to treat nicotine addictions. So it shows, it's because, again, so cannabinoids, yes, they bind to this reward system, but they bring balance there. It takes a lot of misuse to get a molecule whose basic message is balance to get it out of balance. This is why these cannabinoids actually are showing potential that they're not the entry drug, but rather the exit drug. And I'm closing. Let me just say that bliss is definitely not the problem. We should all be seeking it. But ignorance that comes with cannabinoids, that is the serious problem. And I'm done.
Danke vielmals, danke vielmals. Ja, André, ich glaube, das war...
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much.